Good morning, everybody. Let's begin with prayer. O God of creation and covenant, we know that your holiness prevents us from coming too close to you, so we give you thanks that you instead come close to us. That you have come near to us in the commands, the written word, and in the living word, Jesus Christ our Lord. We want to welcome a guest today, Catherine, who's come all the way from Greensburg to visit us. Thank you for being here. So you all be on the best behavior today. Good to see everybody who's normally here in person, and we've got some normal colleagues who are online and some on injured reserve who join us by Zoom today too. So good to see everybody here. I need to do this regardless of how many people we have online, but just realizing that sometimes my eyes are looking here and maybe not here. If you need to ask a question or something, if you would just wave at me, and those of you online, wave a second, and I will recognize that and call on you just to get my attention. That would be great. And I know that you can't always hear if somebody else is asking a question, and you don't want to talk over somebody if you're zooming in. So we'll do that, and hopefully that will work for us. Last time we went through the first half, basically the book of Exodus. The part that gets most attention, the rescue from Egypt and the crossing of the Red Sea. But we noted then that that's not even half of the book of Exodus. And the second half we pick up today. In many ways, this is the more important half, the part that in which we see really Israel's identity coming to the fore. The chapters we're looking at today present to us really three new parts to the story. First, there's the life in the wilderness, where God provides for the daily needs of the Israelites, where the Israelites learn to live in the manna economy, as Davis puts it. The real lesson here is that Israel has to learn to live by trust in God. That's a theme you recognize going back not just to Abraham, but it's highlighted there. And it's another one of those signs that the Old Testament is not a book of law, as opposed to the New Testament, which is about grace and trust. It's really about trust all the way through. And we really see it in the wilderness passages. The second part is the giving of the law. Here we see God entering into covenant with Israel. And Israel has to learn to live in relationship with God. That's really what the legal parts of the Old Testament are all about. Who is this God who brought them out of Egypt, and how do we relate to this God? It's not a life of legalism. It's a life of learning how to live in a way that honors the creation and how to revere the Creator. We'll say more about that in a little bit. The final part of this second half of Exodus is about building a sanctuary. That's sort of the central feature of it. There's a lot more to it than that, as we'll see. But this is about Israel being formed as a worshiping community. Maybe the key verse in this second half of the book is in chapter 19, verse 6, one that your textbook also highlights. You shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. The purpose of this second half of the book is to form Israel into that. And it strikes me that that's also what the church is, and it gives us maybe the key to how to understand the book of Exodus and appropriate it to the life of the church. So I want to present this second half of the book in three primary blocks of material, and I put those here on the board. 1522 through 1827, through the end of chapter 18 is the first block. It begins right after the account of the crossing of the sea, right after the Song of the Sea, the celebration of the rescue from Pharaoh. Chapters 19 to 23 give us the giving of the law. The giving of the law, however, is set within a narrative. The narrative begins with approaching Sinai, and all that chapter 19 is about God's holiness, not being able to come too close, standing at a distance from the awesome presence of God. Chapter 24 is a kind of transition. We could include that in this final section. Or with this one, it really could go with either. And then the final large block of material, chapters 25 through 40, is about the building of the sanctuary. First, instructions about how to build a sanctuary, and then the conclusion of the book, the actual building, which is almost an exact repetition, but just reporting that what's been instructed and laid out to Moses is now being done, which, as your textbook says, may seem incredibly boring to many people. But whenever we come across something that seems repetitious and boring, we have to wonder, why was it written this way? Was it just that these ancient people were really interested in the materials that went into the curtain of the sanctuary, and what kind of rings it would have and things like that? Is that really the case? I think it's rather the case that the details tell us something about the purpose of this, which is holiness. And so the exactness of the design is part of the message. So the plan for the sanctuary and the building of this portable sanctuary shrine that will go with the Israelites to the wilderness concludes the book. But there's this part in between the two that take up chapters 32 to 34 that's really, really important, and that gives us something of the purpose of the instructions and the building of the sanctuary. Namely, the Israelites here make an image and worship it. God nearly wipes them out, but God doesn't. And then the covenant is renewed. A new copy of the commandments are written and given. God declares who God is. We'll say more about that in a moment. And then the building of the sanctuary. And Davis, wonderfully characterizes this large block of material and how it flows together. The golden calf episode represents Israel's rebellion, the building of the sanctuary, the renewal of the covenant, redemption, revival, forgiveness. And so the whole thing, all this priestly material, all that we might not want to read in detail, gives us in detail the lengths to which God goes to work out the forgiveness of these rebellious people. So that last section is really important. In the lectionary, these passages in 32 to 34 come up fairly regularly. The stuff on each side, not at all. But the stuff on each side is a key to understanding what is there in the center. So we should not forget that. The first block of material, after being rescued at the sea, God tells them to head on out into the wilderness. And the story here is really all about learning to live in God's economy, not in Pharaoh's economy. It begins to create, subtly for the most part, but very clearly, a difference between the way these people will live under the rulership of God, as opposed to how they've been living under Pharaoh. So, and I think this, by the way, if you haven't figured out why I picked the textbook that I picked for you, this section should tell you why. I mean, it is a beautiful account of the theological significance of the wilderness account, the giving of the law, and the building of the sanctuary. And so it really highlights, how in Pharaoh's economy, you work as slaves, you accumulate things and store them up. That's what Pharaoh is all about. In God's economy, you rely on God, you live as free people, but that means that you live by faith. And God's the one who provides. So the provisions come in a number of episodes. The first is the Israelites are without water. There's water, but it can't be consumed, and so it's purified. 15:22 to 27. Then the part that gets the most attention, that ultimately is most important for the memory of this time, is the giving of manna. Now, the word itself is important. There's a description of it, it's this flaky substance that appears on the ground, the Israelites collect it. But the word comes from a little particle in Hebrew that simply begins a question, what? And the food is called manna is explained by the fact that the Israelites asked the question, what is it? And it's never quite answered, but the name is what we get from that. I've heard that if you go to the Bible Museum in Washington, D.C., what's that thing called? You can get manna on the menu in the cafe. I'm not sure how they pulled that off, but where the recipe for that comes from. But I've read that that's the case.
They gathered off the Capitol lawn.
Oh.
Probably stole it.
It's funny, there was a New York Times story about the museum some time ago, and they presented the irony that the visitors who were eating manna were there on the Sabbath, and yet manna was there on the menu. They're missing something in their plan. Notice, though, in this story of giving of manna, embedded in the story is the Sabbath. And I don't know if you noticed or not in reading through this material, but I'll highlight it in a number of places. Sabbath really permeates these chapters. It's really remarkable how that's the case. In every part, Sabbath plays a major part. So at every turn, it seems, the Israelites are to learn to observe the Sabbath. So in 1622 and following, on the sixth day, they gathered twice as much food, 2 omers apiece. When all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. And all that is left over put aside to be kept until morning." So they put it aside until morning as Moses commanded them. And it did not become foul, and there were no worms in it. Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, which is the Sabbath, there will be none." And of course, some tried to gather it on the Sabbath, and there was none. This Sabbath command here about the manna is the first of the accounts that let us know that this is not just an ordinary story about people being preserved in the wilderness. It's a people who are learning to live according to the wishes and designs of the Creator and in concert with the creation. Sabbath, and we'll say more about this when we get to the commandments. Sabbath is to remind them of who the Creator is. The ceasing on the Sabbath is not, as Davis says, to avoid burnout. That's often how we treat it. And in the self-help literature of a religious variety, Sabbath is used for that purpose. And it can have that impact on us, but that's not the purpose. That's a byproduct and a blessing of it, because as I noted in the title for this section of our course, the law is all about saving us from ourselves. But the way God saves us from ourselves is to remind us who God is, and to urge us to live, as though God is the Creator. So Sabbath reminds us that God created the world. We have to stop our accumulation, our manipulation of the world, and remember that it's God who has made it. And that puts us in our proper place. And so the cessation of the collecting of manna on the Sabbath is the first of those exercises in Sabbath faithfulness. Then manna, a bit of it, is to be preserved, and will go into the ark when it's created, when it's constructed, as a remembrance of this time. Manna is very important. God feeds them. You notice God feeds the people in other ways too. God gives quail when they complain that there's no meat. But it's primarily manna that's remembered. The manna that comes every day, and they learn to rely on God. Then God gives water from the rock, chapter 17, verses 1 to 7. So there's the cleansing of water, the provision of bread, the provision of water. There comes something next that's really important that anticipates some things that will come later in the narrative, and that is God defends them from an enemy. The enemy, which shows up in verse 8 of chapter 17, is simply named Amalek. Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. We don't know where Amalek came from or who Amalek was. Moses said to Joshua, "Choose some men for us and go out, fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand." So Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill. And so Moses holds up his hands as if in prayer, that is the intention, and Israel prevailed during that whole time. He lowered his hands, Amalek prevailed. And so Moses grows tired, and they have to prop up his hands so he can hold up his hands, continuing to pray, and they prevail over Amalek. Then there's this conclusion to the story, which is the first of these maybe very troubling declarations about the enemy. The Lord said to Moses, "Write this as a reminder in a book and recite it in the hearing of Joshua. I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven." And Moses built an altar and called it, "The Lord is my banner." He said, "A hand upon the banner of the Lord. The Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation." Now, the reason this upsets people is that here God has an enemy, and God will fight against this enemy from generation to generation. But who is this enemy? I mean, we have no idea. And the enemy is going to show up, this Amalek, by the way, later on in the narrative, particularly when we get to Saul. And Saul is told to go and to fight against the Amalekites, people who had descended from this enemy from the wilderness. And we don't know any more about the Amalekites when we meet them in Samuel than we do here, except a few details. They have a king and so on. And one of maybe the rap against Saul is that he refuses to put Amalek to death. to do away with them, which is the command. And at the same time, David fights against Amalekites at the end of 1 Samuel. We see him fighting against Amalekites. It's an Amalekite who shows up to tell him that Saul's been killed and lies to him about Saul's death. And so he thinks that this man has killed Saul. The Lord's going to get him put to death. Amalek will show up again in Esther, very end of the material we're covering, in a really interesting way. The enemy of these Jewish exiles, who's trying to do away with them as a people, has descended from this Amalekite king that Saul refused to kill. Now, I mean, what are the odds that hundreds of years later, this villain in Persia would be a direct descendant of this king who eventually was killed in the time of King Saul in Judah? It almost seems like a cartoon, doesn't it? Which I think is part of the point here. The enemy is someone we know nothing about. There's a wonderful commentary on 1st and 2nd Samuel that I use regularly, and it treats the material wonderfully. But there's what seems to me a kind of humorous part of the commentary is a page where they have a little map of Amalekites, like where they come from and so on, as though we know any of that. And we don't know any of that. They show up out of nowhere in the wilderness. And when this is remembered in Deuteronomy, that's the point. They show up out of nowhere and they fight against the Israelite when the Israelites are defenseless and so on. So this is an enemy a lot like Pharaoh in Exodus, who is opposed to the creational work of God. This economy God's creating among these people, which is against the economy of Pharaoh, Amalek is trying to undo. And I think that really is the way we ought to read it. This is, it sees Amalek as emblematic of evil, which some might say, well, that goes against sort of the plain reading of the text. But I think maybe not, because what is the plain reading of the text? The enemy is someone we know nothing about, and does seem to have this character of one who opposes the very work of God in the world, like the unnamed Pharaoh of Exodus 1-15. So, Church Father Origen, famously commenting on this story of Amalek, seized upon the role of Joshua here. Joshua appears for the first time in this story, and note he is introduced simply by his name and not, as he will be later, by identified with his father and called the son of Nun. So Origen seized on that little detail and said, Joshua here, he's reading the Greek version, the Jesus we meet here is not Jesus, the son of Nun, it's Jesus, the son of God. That is, Jesus, the son of God. He sees this as Jesus showing up, battling against evil as Jesus battles against the forces of evil in the stories in the New Testament. And while that's a creative and it links together text and it reads Jesus into the story, the writer has no knowledge of Jesus or anything like that. Nevertheless, Origen does seem to be onto something here about the nature of the story itself. So the Israelites are preserved from this enemy. Then finally, Moses' father-in-law shows up and helps Moses establish a system of justice. This is sort of like all this symbolic stuff, faith-filled stuff, and now we have something that seems completely practical, but it too is theological. It says something about how these people are operating. There is a system of justice that they can rely on. we get to the next block of material. And again, chapter 19 is about the people approaching the mountain and then being consecrated. And the focus here is really on God's holiness. God's presence on the mountain is such that the people can't go up. So verses 23 through 25, Moses said to the Lord, the people are not permitted to come up to Mount Sinai, for you yourself warned us, saying, set limits around the mountain and keep it holy. The Lord said to him, go down and come up, bringing Aaron with you, but do not let either the priest or the people break through to come up to the Lord. Otherwise, he will break out against them. So Moses went down to the people and told them. And according to Deuteronomy, they're just fine with that. As they remember it, they see the smoke on the mountain and the thunder, the signs of God's awesome presence. And they say, Moses, maybe you ought to just go up there and let us stay here. And we'll watch over things down around the base of the mountain. And so Moses goes up. Chapter 20 then gives us maybe the central text in this whole block of material, at least the one that gets most attention, and was very, very important. The 10 Commandments, or the 10 words, as they will be called later in chapter 34. I understand about this temptation to buy books, but let me mention a book, a resource. I said earlier, be careful, I think, buying books that are just treatments of themes and subjects that you might read and then put away and not read again. But resources are things that are worth buying. And if you're going to do an extensive study of the 10 Commandments, Patrick Miller's book, called The 10 Commandments, is a marvelous resource. It's in this series that there's the interpretation commentary series, and then a spinoff from it called Interpretation Resources for the Use of Scripture in the Church. Miller was the general editor of that series. He died last year, but was the general editor until he couldn't continue that, and sort of the creator of that series, and he wrote the first volume in it, this volume on the 10 Commandments. And what's great about it is that Miller does all the things that you would expect. He tells you what this language, do not kill, and things like that, mean, the context of the language in the Old Testament. But he really takes each commandment and puts each one into its larger canonical context and shows us how each of the commandments reaches out and connects with a multitude of other texts. Now, the first commandment is the richest of these. I mean, it reaches to so many other parts of the canon. And then we can readily see that. But he does the same thing with the other commandments as well. And I say if you're going to study the 10 Commandments, this is a great resource, because you can start to see how the commandments are not legalism at work. They are deep, profound theology. Every single one of them is. And Miller just does a fabulous job of showing us how that's the case. So there's the book to go and buy today. As your textbook points out, the creation of the covenant here in general follows a pattern that we know from the suzerainty treaties of the ancient Near East, and the parts of the treaty are listed in the chapter. These treaties discovered, and the best examples of them, the ones left behind by the Hittites, that Anatolian kingdom, we saw on our map the location of the kingdom close to what we will come to know as Assyria later. there's a preamble or introduction to these treaties. There's a historical prologue in which the suzerain, the dominant king who's making the treaty with a lesser king, reminds of how he has protected or stood by, supported the lesser king. Then that's the basis of stipulations that the suzerain places on the vassal. Following that, there are typically blessings and curses. There are blessings if you abide by the covenant, but if the vassal breaks the covenant, the treaty, there are curses. Then there are witnesses called or recognized to the treaty. And finally, there is often a record of or provision for a written copy of the treaty and depositing it somewhere. Now, you'll notice as the textbook lists these elements that not all of them are listed as something here in Exodus. Many people have thought that the book of Deuteronomy as a book follows this pattern. And you'll see a number of the examples given that appear in Deuteronomy. When we get to, and the Berman book will talk about this as well, but when we get to Deuteronomy, I will point out that the pattern doesn't fit exactly Deuteronomy either. The prominent thing missing is the historical prologue. Or, well, there's sort of a historical prologue, but the most obvious thing that you would expect to find in the historical prologue, namely the Exodus, is not there. So it doesn't fit exactly. So what's best, I think, for us to understand is that this treaty form is something people in the ancient Near East, ancient Israelites knew, they were familiar with it, and it influenced the casting of the covenant between God and Israel. But it's an influence. It's not an exact pattern. So that's something to keep in mind. And just to know that this way of talking, speaking, presenting things was in the air in the ancient Near East. But that's about all we should say about it. The Ten Commandments themselves begin with a very important prologue and statement that is sort of like a historical account, if you will, the first two verses. I think this is really important because you are aware, I suppose, of the battles that have gone on over the Ten Commandments display in public. It's been big in the news from time to time in the last 20 years. And what usually happens in these debates is that some government official is defending the presentation of the Ten Commandments on a side of a courthouse or in some monument on public grounds or something like that. And the case that's usually made for why to keep the Ten Commandments there is something like, well, this is just part of our heritage as Americans. And, I sort of get what those people are trying to do. They're trying to not lose the Christian influence and the biblical influence on our society, and that's well and good. But if you do not recognize the God who has rescued Israel from slavery in Egypt, then you really are not following the Ten Commandments. That's the part that is crucial. And some of these displays of the commandments, don't have the first part, which is kind of strange to me. It's really something you can't do without. And so the commandments begin. The Lord spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. This begins not with stipulations, but with the statement of God's salvation. And the pattern here is really important to keep straight. It's just like we say, in our theological formulations, our obedience is in response to God's grace. God's prior action makes possible our obedience. And the expectations on Israel grow out of this identity of God as the one who rescued them from slavery in Egypt. Everything else flows from that. So, note also, as we look at the commandments, the order of the commandments that I'll present is the order usually recognized by the Jewish community and by the Reformed tradition. But in some Christian traditions, the order has been different. Lutherans, for example, combine the first two commandments into one, the absolute devotion to God and the prohibition against making images. And then they split the final commandment into two. So the counting is a little different. I'm going to go with the former of these. The first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me, is the wording here. Exactly what this means is not perfectly evident. What does before me mean? Does that mean in my presence? Does that mean beside me as in a shrine? You don't set up the image of another deity in the place where I'm worshiped. It's not exactly clear. The gist of the commandment is clear. God demands absolute loyalty. You don't have to worship any other gods, and that becomes clear in many other texts. But exactly what's intended or imagined here is not. Very wooden translation, so that before me is the word for face.
Okay.
Comes from the same root word. Yeah. So that's why I'm saying it's not clear if it's saying don't have any representations of other gods in front of me, or if it's don't place them alongside the representation of my throne or whatever in the central shrine. It's not exactly clear. The second commandment is a really important one. It's really important for the narrative. And we can see, I think, why it goes with the first, but the implications of it are not always immediately obvious. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or in the water under the, or on earth beneath, or in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. Notice how long this one is. It's obviously really important. I mean, all of them are important, but there's a lot to this. So what does it mean to not make an idol? The Israelites are not to worship the idols of other gods. That much is clear. But it seems that here the issue is the making of a representation of Yahweh. They're not to do that. And I say it that way because this is precisely the issue with the golden calf. When the golden calf is constructed in chapter 32, the golden calf is not representing another deity. It's to represent Yahweh. We'll look at the text and see how it says that plainly. The calf is made, and they declare, or Aaron declares, a feast to Yahweh. So what's the big issue here? Don't make any representation of the God you have. The whole issue seems to be that God can't be captured in an image. If you make an image that you can carry around, that you can control, that you can set up in a shrine and then move to another place if you wish, then you delude yourself into thinking you control this God. But this command prohibits all of that thinking. I am a jealous God, which again may mean I will be jealous if you worship other deities. Well, good question. So let me hold the question just a second, and I'll come to that and answer it in a little larger way about crucifix, representations of Jesus, and other things as well. Okay, just a second. The idea that God can somehow be limited to where an image is the real temptation. And again, we see that in the golden calf story. They start carrying the image around and declaring plural. I will think about that in a moment. These are the gods who brought us out of the land of Egypt. And we know where this God is. We can touch the God and make God do whatever we want. That's not to be the case. Yeah. I know the author you're speaking of. I don't know this particular book. Although I have to say, this author kind of talks about, he had a book on the historical Jesus a number of years ago, so it sort of touches on everything, tries to be a popular writer. And so people who do that often, as he did with the book on Jesus, sort of presents things that are true, but a little misleading because there's not quite enough context. So why do we have a prohibition? We have a prohibition because obviously people did this or thought it was a good idea. And the calf or the bull would be the primary choice. This is how the Canaanites represented their god Baal. He was a fertility deity, and so representing him in the form of a bull made most sense. And if you don't understand why, go visit a farm sometime and watch what bulls do. That was, these were people who lived with an agricultural setting and watched animal behavior. And so the bull was the obvious representation that made sense. The Israelites would create the same image. Yes, indeed, it happened, but that's every time you have a prohibition, you got to think behind that is some practice that's being legislated against, and that's exactly right. So that happened. We know that from archaeology. We know that from the text itself. We have examples of that. God can't be represented in any of these ways because God can't be adequately captured in an image of any creature, as it says, in heaven, on earth, or in the waters below. And if you try to do that, you start thinking that you control God. So the question about the crucifix is an interesting one. The Orthodox will say eventually, okay, we've got a prohibition against images. Of course, they have to deal with this because they are producing images of Jesus. They said it's allowed to create these images because we have the incarnation. God has taken on human flesh, and so Jesus Christ was one people could see and touch and relate with, in a physical way. And so the Orthodox concluded then it's okay to create images of Jesus. So I don't think that, in creating those kinds of images, we're breaking his commandment in any way. We recognize that the crucified Christ, particularly that image, tells us something about who God is that's really unique and important. We can do that and still recognize and observe, this law, this prohibition. We have to be careful about it, however, I think all the time. And one of the ways that we run the risk of breaking the commandment, frankly, is with our theology. Not with the physical images, but with the verbal images we create. We sometimes speak of God in ways that would limit God. We speak as though we've got God all wrapped up. God is just this or that, or you understand what I'm saying. So we who do theology are maybe at greatest risk, and we have to be careful about that. It's something to attend to. Yeah. Very good question. Thank you. But God's jealousy is the underlying motivation for this, recognizing that God does care how we speak or represent God, and we have to be careful about that, not to present God as a physical presence that we can manipulate. The rest of the commandments, I'm not going to go through every one, but I want to just make a few notes about some of them. The wrongful use of the name seems to have to do with using God's name in things like curse formulas and in oath formulas to try to gain some advantage for oneself, by this speech that's understood in the ancient world as having an almost magical quality. So it's not cursing, that's what I grew up with. You don't ever use the Lord's name in vain, that is, you have a certain expression you don't say. Maybe good not to say that we were taught not to say, but that's not quite what the commandment is getting at. Here too, there's a common use of God's name that we might count as using God's name in vain, and that is saying things like, the Lord told me to do this or that. Television evangelist, or bad about that. Winning an advantage over people by claiming to have God wrapped up. The fourth commandment is the command of Sabbath. And notice it too is a very lengthy commandment, verses 8 through 11. It is grounded in creation. It points back to Genesis 2, 1 to 3. We're to observe the Sabbath precisely because God ceased working on the Sabbath. When you read Genesis 2, 1 to 3, though, it's a very nuanced statement, and again, I've said this before, but it's a good reason to take Hebrew, because you might not get it unless you really read it in Hebrew. It says God ceased, but it's that God completed the work on the seventh day. God's work was the cessation of work. It's both at the same time. So Sabbath is this unique day that links everything to the creation and reminds us who the Creator is. Really important here in the Sabbath command, however, is the way it makes provision for everyone and everything, human and non-human alike. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the seventh day and consecrated it. More on slaves and all that in a few moments. But your servants, your animals are not to labor this day. The resident alien, not even part of your community, but who's living in your midst, is not to work on that day. Everyone is to cease their labor. And later text will talk about this as Davis notes, as giving them a breather. Not just for those who are wealthy, those who have means, those who own things, but everybody. These first four commandments we can see as one tablet. You know, Moses comes down the mountain with two tablets. We don't know exactly what they look like and all that, but we seem to have two tablets, two tables of the commandments. The first four here have to do with relationship with God. The last of the commandments are going to have to do with relationship with other people. And as Miller in the book I referred to earlier will point out, the fifth commandment is really a bridge between the two. Honoring father and mother is something that links the first table and the second table. Just a couple of notes about the second part of the commandments. Some of them are quite objective things. Do not kill, or as the New RSV puts it, do not murder. That seems to be the intention there. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. When you work on these, you'll find there are other possible nuances and need for explanation, but for the most part, they are clear, and they're things that you can hear, read, and say, okay, I can not do that. I can avoid being a false witness in the city gate and so on. The final commandment, however, is sort of remarkable in that it's got to do with the interior of the person. It's intangible. And in some ways, it provides a corrective to thinking that we've just got some legal requirements here, and here are things that you are not to do. And if you don't do these things in the second table, you're preserving your community. The 10th commandment suggests, no, that's not enough. Your intentions, the place of your heart, is also crucial for really observing the commandments and following them. After the 10 commandments, then, we have a very important section, 21. I'm going to divide it a little differently than they just did. 22, 23, 19 is a block of legal material commonly called the Covenant Code. Most Pentateuchal scholars think that this is the oldest law code in the Torah, in the Pentateuch. And it comes immediately after the 10 Commandments. So just a few notes about this. First, it starts with a law about an altar. And this would not be the thing that maybe would warm the cockles of our hearts. Why all this talk about an altar? Again, it is part of that creation honoring identity of the people. The altar is made out of earth, not stone. Next, there is this regulation of debt slavery. So first, recognize it is debt slavery. That's what's being discussed here. And as our textbook says, it probably has its setting in the monarchy. That is, which is, she doesn't explain this exactly, but you gather from this that this is a law code that has to do with the life of people who are already settled in the land, who have a structured life, and who are not wandering in the wilderness. This is for a future time. And so it's being read back into this wilderness period, this foundational period. But it makes sense really against the monarchy. When a king taxed people, taxed their produce, and also conscripted some of them into forced labor. The peasant farmer who was called away to work on some building project and did not have the option of saying no, might well then fall into debt and have to sell the ancestral land and work on it to work off the debt. That's the kind of image we get of this. When wealthy people, wealth began to accumulate, and people who had wealth took the land of others to pay debts. This is something that the 8th century prophets will rail against. You know, Micah especially speaks against this practice. It goes directly against the traditions of life in the land. We're going to get to that and how the land is distributed when we get to Jerome and Joshua. But the ideal is that every family has property that is their economic base, and it's their piece of the promise of the covenant people. And so when the monarchy allowed these hierarchies to arise, people began to lose their ancestral land. So that's the picture here. The important thing here in the regulation of debt slavery is that it's regulated, that limits are put on it. So people cannot remain debt slaves forever. And importantly here, the limits are all linked to the Sabbath. So just as you cease labor on the seventh day, so also you are to release your debt slaves in the seventh year. So we won't go through all of the laws. We're going to be talking about some of these laws or similar laws when we look at Leviticus next time. But just note how the covenant code begins to come to an end. Chapter 23, verses 10 and 11. First of all, the Sabbath and sabbatical year again. For 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield. But the seventh year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, so that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the wild animals may eat. You shall do the same with your vineyard and with your olive orchard. The land itself is given a break, and even the wild animals are given free reign over this land in the sabbatical year. Verses 12 and 13, 6 days you shall do your work, but on the seventh day you shall rest, that your ox and your donkey may have relief, and your homeborn slave and the resident alien may be refreshed. This is the passage Davis was citing when she translated the text of breath. Be attentive to all that I've said to you. Do not invoke the name of God. Do not let them be heard on your lips. Sabbath is key to everything. The law codes are punctuated by it, as is the narrative as well. The end of chapter 23 looks forward to the conquest of the land, and we'll pick that up when we come to Deuteronomy and Joshua. Chapters 24 through 40 then begin to present the plan for the sanctuary. Up on the mountain, the commandments had been given but not written at this point, so the Lord is going to write them And the Lord writes those commands on tablets. And then the Lord gives Moses these instructions for the making of the Ark of the Covenant. So, you know, that everybody learns about the Ark of the Covenant. Indiana Jones, good to read chapter 25 of Exodus, maybe, and see what it says about it. The other implements that will go into this tabernacle, the tabernacle itself in chapter 26, but all of its implements, its furniture, everything is covered here as though every detail is important. 2 chapters lay out what the priesthood will be like, and we'll talk about the priesthood a bit more on another day when maybe we'll touch on it next time in Leviticus. And finally, in 31, verses 12 and following, after all of these commands, we've got Sabbath again. The Lord said to Moses, you are yourself are to speak to the Israelites, you shall keep my Sabbaths. For this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, given in order that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you. You shall keep the Sabbath because it is holy for you. Everyone who profanes it shall be put to death. Whoever does any work on it shall be cut off from the people. 6 days' work shall be done, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath shall be put to death. Therefore, the Israelites shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign forever between me and the people of Israel. In 6 days, the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the 7th day he rested and was refreshed. Pretty tough. Anybody who doesn't observe the Sabbath is to be put to death. One of those laws that we have a hard time imagining being put into place in a literal way, but the severity of the statement tells you how important this law is, because to not abide by this law is to ignore who the Creator is, which is the basis of all these laws in the first place. Well, all this is presented to Moses, and then verse 31, when God finished speaking with Moses on Mount Sinai, he gave him the 2 tablets of the covenant, tablets of stone written with the finger of God. So that's the one place about the law, you know, that the 10 Commandments presents, and Moses is standing back, and it's like some artisan is at work with fire, like a welder doing his work, and Moses is watching, and he comes down the mountain with the tablets. Moses comes down the mountain. Before he gets there, the people have become restless and decide, we don't know where Moses is, and we don't know about this God who he's meeting with. Moses has been up on the mountain all this time. And so they come to Aaron and convince him to make an idol. It's actually God's plural here. And Aaron said, these are your gods. Why more than one? And it's not clear why there's more than one referred to, but it may be that this already has in mind another story over in 1 Kings, when Solomon dies and the northern kings depart and are led by Jeroboam I. Jeroboam sets up shrines in Bethel and in Dan, 2 extreme territory, parts of his territory. And there in both places puts a calf that represents Yahweh, 2 of them. And it's both in creating a sanctuary that's not Jerusalem, and in setting up this image of Yahweh that the biblical writer denounces these sanctuaries and these calves, and they will be destroyed. It may be that the writer here already has in mind these 2 images that are put in place by Jeroboam. Well, this obviously is breaking the second commandment, even before Moses has come down and delivered the written form of it. And because of this, Yahweh threatens to wipe the people out. Notice, though, again, this is an image of Yahweh. Verses 4 to 6 of the story. He took the gold from them, formed it in a mold, and cast an image of a calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt." Same God you've been talking about. That's who this is. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a festival to the Lord." They're not trying to worship another God. They think they're worshiping Yahweh. They're doing it with this image. So when Moses sees or hears of God's reaction, that God's going to wipe them out and start over with Moses, he says. Moses famously intercedes, verses 12 to 13. He says, "Turn from your fierce wrath, change your mind, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, how you swore to them by your own self, saying to them, I will multiply your descendants like the stars of the heaven, and all this land that I promised I give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever." And the Lord changed his mind about the disaster he planned to bring on the people. So it's often said that Moses and Amos, the prophet from the 8th century, are the only figures in the Old Testament who ask God to repent, essentially. Don't do this, and God responds and changes the plan. Amos chapter 7, in his visions, Amos prays a similar prayer. But this is a really important picture of Moses as the intercessor, and it will become kind of the model for who prophets are. Prophets are not just people who blast their audience with judgment. If they deliver words of judgment, their role is to be an intercessor, to stand between the people and God, and to plead with God not to let the disaster happen. Jeremiah, will say when he's defending himself and his embrace of the role of prophet, he says, "I didn't wish for the day of disaster." And he's been interceding for the people all along. And finally, God says, enough of that. I'm not going to hear any more of your prayers for these people. But Jeremiah's been doing it even while these people are trying to kill him. He's interceding for them. That's the role of the prophet, as one like Moses. And Moses displays it here. The prayer of Moses is going to show up again in Psalm 90, much later text that is not talking about God's wrath in this form, but it's addressing the exile. And it's as though Moses now, this bigger than life figure who transcends time, who prays for the Israelites at a much later period of time. So influential was his prayer on behalf of the Israelites. As Psalm 106 will say, Moses stood in the breach between God and Israel. Well, God decides not to kill them, although there are some people who die, as you know the story here. Moses intercedes, and then they're commanded to leave Sinai, and they begin to leave, and we have this tent of meeting that's set up. It's the place where God descends and God's presence appears, and it's the precursor to the sanctuary that's being constructed in the wilderness. In chapter 33, Moses asks, as God promises to go with these people, I'm not going to give up on them. Moses asked to be shown God's glory, which seems to be a petition to see God's face. That expression, God's glory, is a priestly expression that seems to be asking that. You see this language in Ezekiel when he describes seeing a vision of God. He said, I saw something like the glory of the Lord. Say he saw God's face. And God says, no, you can't see that. This is related to the idea of the image in a sense, in that humans are not to create images of God. Why not? Because you don't know what God looks like. You can't stand to look at the fullness of God's presence in God's face. And so God says, no, Moses, I won't do that, but I'll hide you in the cleft of the rock and pass by and let you see my backside. And so we talked about this, we talked about the symbolic interpretation of the Old Testament. And so Augustine said what Moses saw when he saw God's backside was Christ. Moses saw some part of God that he as a frail human being could stand and still survive. Well, Moses comes back and brings 2 tablets back with him. And then there is, in chapter 34, as the covenant is being renewed or about to be renewed, the Lord gives a self-revelation, verses 6 and 7. This is a very important passage because it becomes like a creed in the Old Testament. It shows up in many, many other passages. It will appear in the book of the 12 in abbreviated form, though clearly being referred to in Micah, in Nahum, and in Jonah. 3 books that stand together in the book of the 12, applied in slightly different ways in each place, but God's self-revelation is the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, yet by no means clearing the guilty, but visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the children and children's children to a 3rd and 4th generation. The highlight here is God's graciousness and mercy, God's willingness to relent from punishing, and that becomes the confession of who Yahweh is. It's emblematic of what God does with these people who are disobedient, who have made their own images against the commandments, and yet God said, I'm going to start over with you anyway, and continue on. Following this, the book ends with the making of the tabernacle, chapters 35 through 40. And this, as your textbook says, is a sign of the covenant being renewed. Worship is the context of this redemption that happens. And the book ends then with God's presence showing up at the tent of meeting.